In this lesson, we're going to be focusing on cybersecurity vulnerabilities and exploits. So, in the previous lesson, we discussed the importance of cybersecurity and the importance of understanding the threats, different types of threats, and we identified different types of threat actors and the attack vectors that exist. Um, Today, let's just focus on vulnerabilities themselves. Like, what's a vulnerability, right? Vulnerability is a weakness or flaw in a system, in a network, or a software that can be exploited by malicious actors. And there are so many components where vulnerabilities exist, like your operating systems, your applications, your web servers, your databases, and of course, human behavior. And exploiting vulnerabilities, or when a vulnerability is exploited, it can lead to unauthorized access, data breaches, it can lead to disruption in systems. Remember, it's all connected, right? The threat actors are motivated by what they want to achieve. They want to achieve unauthorized access, they want to get access to data, they want to disrupt the system. How do they do this? By exploiting vulnerabilities. Some common vulnerabilities, of course, we have social engineering, you have lack of security awareness that makes people more vulnerable. We have network vulnerability like weak encryption. So if your encryption isn't very strong, it can be bypassed. You can have misconfigured firewalls, you can have Wi-Fi networks that are not secure. And when it comes to your applications, you can have things like cross-site scripting, SQL injection. You can have things like unpatched software or vulnerable components. You can have situations where default or weak passwords are used, so that instantly creates a pathway for attackers to gain access. You can have a case where input is not properly validated. So attackers can take advantage of that to inject commands into the server by using the inputs that normal users are supposed to use. You can have inadequate error handling, because when errors are not handled properly, the errors themselves can expose details about a system that the attacker is not supposed to know. So sometimes you would see attackers actually trying to trigger errors because they know that sometimes some errors might not be properly handled and reveal sensitive information about the server or system. And you can have insecure file and data permissions. So you permissions if the permissions model is broken, certain users are not supposed to have access to certain things, and they do have that access because it hasn't been set up properly. So let's discuss some of the exploitation techniques. You might have heard about phishing attacks. This is an exploitation technique because if someone falls for a phishing attack and they click on a link or whatever, sometimes that link might be a link to a malware. It might be a link to a credential harvesting website where you know it looks like a legitimate website, and then the user puts in their credentials. Of course, malware is something that classic attackers use it to you know gain access to systems, because once you're infected, then attackers can use that to exploit vulnerabilities or to run code that does what they want. We have social engineering. Phishing is an example of social engineering, but there are other ways like phone calls, or even in real life. We have weak passwords. We talked about that already. We have software vulnerabilities. So attackers taking advantage of weaknesses in our software. We can have man in the middle or adversary in the middle attacks, where someone moves in on communications and gains access to data in transit. You can have denial of service attacks, where the main purpose is to just cause disruption, not allow legitimate users to be able to access the data. SQL injection, we talked about that. It's an attack where a an attacker tries to gain access to a system by injecting SQL code into that is run, and then data is leaked to the attacker. You can also have zero-day exploits. We discussed zero-day vulnerabilities. Well, zero-day exploits are cases where, yeah, you have a zero-day vulnerability, but um, sometimes you have exploit code that has been developed and publicly available that anybody can just take and use that to exploit the vulnerability. Sometimes they are called POCs, so proof of concepts. All these things make it easier for vulnerabilities to be exploited. Um, so let's look at vulnerability assessment and scanning. So why do we even scan for vulnerabilities? Why do we try to assess the vulnerabilities in our systems? Well, first of all, you want to identify vulnerabilities before they are exploited, right? So that's the whole point, so that you can fix them or mitigate them. And you need to be able to prioritize the risk, because you might have a case where you have so many vulnerabilities, more vulnerabilities than you can handle at one point in time. So you need to be able to understand how severe is this vulnerability, what risk does it pose, so that you can prioritize them and have a methodical approach to dealing with these vulnerabilities. You don't want to spend a lot of time fixing vulnerabilities that are not that much of a risk while ignoring the ones that are a bigger risk. And sometimes, you have compliance requirements, some regulations and standards require you to assess your vulnerabilities and have like a vulnerability management plan or policy. And of course, at the end of the day, we're trying to protect against exploitation. That's like the main reason why we want to assess vulnerabilities, so that we can proactively address these vulnerabilities and reduce the risk of them being exploited. So some common tools that we use to assess vulnerabilities are things like Nessus, OpenVS, Qualys, Rapid7 Expose, Burp Suite, Acunetics, OpenSCAP, and Nikto. And all these vulnerability assessment tools or scanning tools do different. Some of them are more similar than others. Some of them have specific purposes. For instance, Burp Suite is specifically for web application scanning or API scanning. And you need to be able to understand these tools and the different purposes they have, so that you know the right tool to use in any given scenario. So I'll suggest you just go and search online about these tools to know more about what they do. Um, we also have something very important. So we have this thing called the CVSS scoring system and CVE. So CVE is just common vulnerabilities and exploits, the standard for disclosing vulnerabilities. It's a standard that we use, security professionals use to uniquely identify known vulnerabilities. For CVSS scoring, it's called Common Vulnerability Scoring Standard. And what we use it to do is quantify the severity and impact of vulnerabilities. And you can have a vulnerability that has no impact, which is none, which you can basically just ignore. You can have low, medium, high, and critical. And there's this different ways of scoring it, or different layers or components of the score. You have the base score, which just looks at the exploitability and the impact of the vulnerability. You have the temporal score and you have the environmental score, which adds more context to the scoring of the vulnerability. And so CVE is just the prefix. The year, you'll see CVE 2019 1214 just means that the vulnerability was published in 2019. 1214 is just an incremental number that is used to uniquely identify that vulnerability. So to conclude, it's important for you to understand the CVSS scoring system, to understand what CVE is, and it is essential for security professionals because it enables us to manage vulnerabilities and mitigate risks more efficiently. So, yeah, make sure that you are aware of these things because it's important, and you might get asked in interviews as well. Um, thank you, and we will meet in the next lesson.